Hello and welcome to Lit on Lockdown, where we'll be discussing the week's news. I'm Frances Weetman, editor of Lit, and I'm joined by Adam Barnett, who is a columnist at Lit. And the first topic we're going to be discussing today is COVID, and more specifically, the introduction of the three-tier system. Adam, what were your thoughts on that?
Well, another week when the government covered itself in glory. The most important thing during a pandemic or any kind of crisis like this, or in politics generally, is to maintain public confidence that the government knows what it's doing. And that's why its performance continues to dazzle and amaze.
It seems to be quite a failure in communications, I think, because it seems as though they've replaced one system that was sort of fairly easy to understand for the average person. And now every area's got to work out which tier they're in and whether that tier is changing and then what that tier means. And yes, the BBC has produced a sort of fairly decent guidance page, but it doesn't seem that great a system, to be honest. It may work, I don't know, in terms of limiting infection spread, but if people aren't necessarily going to adhere to the rules on the grounds that they don't actually know what they are, that's going to cause a particular problem.
They risk wearing out people's patience with all this.
Yes.
The complicated rules constantly changing, guidance updated every other week. And also when there's clear scientific advice to do something and the government, instead of doing that, takes, sort of dips its toe in and considers it a little bit and says, we might do this, we might do that, leaks things to the press a few days before it announces it properly, you can jeopardize public confidence in what you're doing, which is essential if any of this is going to work.
Yes. And to add things into the mix, there's obviously a slight problem in the sense that, everything's based on region. And I get the feeling that this system was partly introduced to try and get rid of what was perceived as injustice in the system, in that you'd have large swathes of the population under lockdown. You saw a lot of people in like Greater Manchester being quite annoyed at what some viewed as quite draconian lockdown measures in areas where there weren't necessarily a particularly high rate of infection. And I think going to a localized system is partly an attempt to alleviate that. Although I'm a little bit skeptical because say just for one example, here in the Northeast, there are quite a high number of infections associated with the two Newcastle universities. So there's quite a hot spot there, and also nearest to where I personally live. But as the county of Northumberland, which is massive in terms of geographical area and doesn't have a high population density, it's part of the same regional group, the North of Tyne area. We have the same elected sort of equivalent of a metro mayor. And for that reason, Northumberland will go on lockdown at the same time as Newcastle and North Tyneside. Now, obviously, there's a lot of people in Northumberland who are quite upset about this because they're thinking, the infection rate in Northumberland is very low. Why should they have to adhere to lockdown measures? So there's always problems with the system.
Yeah, and again, it would help if the government had a clear answer to questions like that.
Yeah.
I doubt it's even considered them or could find any of these places on a map.
Yes. Yeah, especially, I mean, you see it in the media as well. It was quite funny. There was a story about Sunderland that was in the national press the other day, and Sky News had marked Sunderland on the map as being in the northwest because there are two places called Sunderland in the UK. One of them's in the northeast and the other's in the northwest. And you'd think if they just had run that by anyone from north of Watford, they could have fixed that.
Well, as someone from Watford, I don't want to give the impression
Yeah.
My geography is anything to be proud of, but fortunately for everyone, I'm not a cabinet minister.
Yeah, and at least you're not in charge of maps for Sky News.
It's a blessing for everyone, but you really do expect more from the government. That's what they're there for.
Completely.
Instead, what we have is open rebellion in Greater Manchester, the potential of restrictions on entering Wales from the hotspot areas.
Yeah.
I mean, you couple it with the border in Kent and everything else, and you really do start to wonder what exactly this government is hoping to achieve.
Yes, and ironically,
I mean, if they were doing this by design, you'd think they were agents of a foreign power or something sent to
yes,
rip up the country.
I thought it did actually say a lot that Boris Johnson has threatened to take action about Greater Manchester if Andy Burnham won't kind of lie down and accept quite, stringent lockdown measures without any kind of financial remuneration package. And I kind of think it's funny that our prime minister's greatest threat is that he actually does his job, that he'll actually intervene and do something. I think it says a lot about the way the government's handled the crisis, to be honest. I think so.
It's a personal crisis and a threat to himself, almost existential, that he might have to do the job that he's wanted for so long, and we've finally gifted him.
Yes, and I actually also think it's quite ironic that in the whole Andy Burnham debacle, the fact that the Metro Mayor system exists in part seemed to be a way that the Conservatives were trying to get a foothold in previously Labour strongholds, so places particularly in the north of England. So they offered financial packages to areas in exchange for a devolved system, which would include a mayor, not an elected assembly, for instance. And I could see that there'd be a very clear benefit to the Conservatives for doing that. You know, traditionally they've fared a lot better in things like individual personality politics. You know, we have Boris Johnson as testament to that. And for that reason, they'd be far more likely to have, for instance, a Conservative Metro Mayor in the north of England, even if all the council seats and so on go to left-wing parties. But it seems to have been a reckoning in that the Metro Mayor, that mayoral system that they've created, is now causing a lot of grief for the Conservatives in central government, now that the Metro Mayors are, you know, they are defending their constituents and trying to fight for economic stability in their regions.
Yes, another advantage for central government, of course, is they can blame the regional mayors if things aren't going right in those areas. They can say, well, there's nothing to do with us, as they do with the devolved regions, like Scottish Assembly and so on.
Yes, completely.
Don't ask us. That's a devolved power. It's none of our business.
Yeah, I mean, we were offered a devolution package here in the north of town area, which we voted for. We took it up. And at the time when this was all being debated, one of my greatest concerns was that this was a way for central government to kind of pass the buck, so to speak, because they could say, well, we've given you a little bit more money and a lot more power. So why haven't you fixed all the problems in the north of England? When the reality is, even with the slight expansion in budgets from the devolved systems, it nowhere near makes up for the financial impact of austerity.
If you're going to add new severe restrictions in certain areas, you need to make sure that people are compensated or supported effectively, people who are out of work. And in particular, they're concerned about the hospitality sector. It's perfectly reasonable to say that if you're going to do this, we need the money to back it up. These are really ABC questions, and the government doesn't have ready answers to them. It can only be because, as we suspect, they haven't thought these things through properly, and they're just responding to the news cycle day to day. Not at all what you'd expect from having a columnist and a clown as prime minister.
Yeah, I do see some of the people who are really quite shocked at the way the government's dealt with this, and to be honest, they seem to be living up to my expectations and more some. It's
a farce. And again, why has no one resigned in this whole period?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly thought when the Cummings scandal happened, when Dominic Cummings it was revealed he'd gone to Durham and back, when he potentially had COVID, and the fact that he wasn't fired for that, I felt like it just sort of shifted, I think, public expectations. This is what this government's going to do. If there's anyone who does something, they're not going to, that's negative, they're not going to take responsibility. They're not, Boris Johnson's not going to fire the relevant people. And that's just continued.
That's when they lost public confidence initially after the pretty solid commitment to the first lockdown.
It kind of troubles me slightly that I've seen quite a few commentators who seem to think that the best way to manage the economy right now is to keep things open. And I can see why they're saying that, but at the same rate, if we could get a control over the virus now, that would probably have a better financial impact in the long run. And I mean, we've seen that with New Zealand. It's actually a vote winner. Being a sort of conservative with a small c and going in with tough measures earlier on and preventing infection spread will help protect the economy to a certain degree and will be a vote winner.
In other words, competent government and leadership is rewarded and appreciated. Yes. That is what
surprisingly.
You want. And even if they took the wrong approach, if they were clear about that, about why they're taking those decisions and why they're changing it and everything, again, it feels almost patronizing to be going through these things, but this is where we are.
And speaking about paternalistic government and police overreach, we need to move on to our second item, which is about Darren Grimes, the Conservative commentator who is being investigated by police on suspicion of stirring up racial hatred because he published an interview that he held with the historian David Starkey, in which David Starkey was racist. It seems to raise a number of questions about freedom of speech under hate crime legislation. What are your thoughts on this, Adam?
So it looks like the police are just responding to a report, but it does lend credence to martyrdom complex for certain political actors, which is potentially its greatest harm. It's not the case that people get arrested for alleged politically incorrect comments.
If news outlets or journalists or commentators can be possibly arrested, potentially arrested, for publishing an interview with somebody with whom they may completely disagree, but contains questionable content, does that limit the potential for things like podcasts and mainstream media interviews? What kind of precedent might it set?
Yeah, it is a risk. And in some ways, it's good that there's been such a pushback to it as a outrageous overreach. As I say, it's also, I think, politically quite stupid because it does seem to give the impression of some kind of alliance between state power and political correctness.
Yes, and the thing that's kind of sad about all of this is that it actually adds fuel to the fire to right-wing commentators who claim that they're being subject to a witch hunt because of political correctness, when I personally would dispute that.
Yeah, there's this nonsense idea that there's some kind of alliance between state power and political correctness and police overreach like this.
One of the things I found quite funny on social media, looking at the response to this, was that the same people who understandably, and I think probably correctly, supported the cancellation of David Starkey when he made the comments he made, were also supportive of Darren Grimes being arrested for publishing said interview. And if that interview had not been published, then there wouldn't have been the fallout. He wouldn't have lost his job. He wouldn't have lost his book deals as a result of his comments. And I think it raises a lot of questions as to the sort of intellectual consistency of those who particularly want to cancel individuals for what they've said.
Yeah, I hope you're using cancellation there in quote marks because it's a very odd concept.
We could have a very long debate about whether cancellation even exists.
Yes, but I mean, I don't think anyone suggests that that people shouldn't be held to account for their opinions, especially when they veer into racism, as
yeah, of course,
Professor Starkey's comments certainly have done. For him to face professional consequences, it's quite another for him to be quizzed by the police, as he was along with Grimes, and even more of a police overreach for them to be questioning the person who interviewed him.
And I mean, it throws up all the questions about cancel culture, whether it really exists, because it seems like, depending on the political leaning of any given commentator, the term cancellation could mean anything from someone receiving death threats for making relatively innocuous statements to people losing their jobs because they have done or said something racist. And I think they're quite different things.
Yeah, so there are a few things to separate out. The debate about so-called cancel culture does seem to bring out the worst in all sorts of people across the issue. It's one thing to hold people account for things they've said. It's another to try and destroy their career as a result of those things. Mm-hmm. There's also no authority, it seems, to appeal to. There's no due process. Who's in charge of cancellation? What does it entail? As you say, does it entail people disagreeing with you, people sending you death threats, you losing your job? There seems to be a spectrum here, and to group it all under one vague word is not helping anyone. Mm-hmm. I think we were going to talk about the UN Human Rights Council, for example.
Yes.
Small thing in itself, but a preposterous, farcical development.
Yes. So in the last week, it was on Tuesday this week, a number of nations were voted onto the UN Human Rights Council. This is an election that happens every year. And the countries that were elected to the Human Rights Council included China, Cuba, and Russia, all of which have been accused of fairly egregious human rights offences. It's not the first time the UN Human Rights Council has been subject to criticism for being inclusive of human rights offenders.
It does make you wonder what the purpose of such a body is if its criteria allows for those sorts of regimes to hold seats.
Yeah. And its founding
there's a
documentation says that human rights abusers shouldn't be elected to the council, but it doesn't seem like there's any sort of checks in place. And there's been a distinct problem in the last few years in that certain states that have committed human rights abuses vote in a bloc so they can protect each other and maintain their seats on the council.
Yeah, so what you get instead is a sort of macabre Eurovision Song Contest arrangement.
Yes. It's a nice parallel.
Where certain countries vote in blocks for certain more powerful countries. Also, it was noted in the reports that Saudi Arabia didn't make it.
Yes.
Didn't make the cut.
Yeah.
Presumably due to their newfound unpopularity under Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the dismemberment of a Washington Post journalist in Saudi Arabia's Turkish embassy. 3 countries I just mentioned, Russia, Iran, and China, all arguably have far worse human rights records and have done things that make that look like small potatoes, as appalling as it was.
Yeah.
So I don't think that the council should get any points for not appointing a comparatively minor despotism like that of Saudi Arabia.
One of the things two things stood out to me about this vote. The first is what you've just said, that Saudi Arabia lost its seat, but China lost about a third of its votes. So it was still elected onto the council, but it had a dip in its votes. And I found that quite interesting because it seems previously that because of China's economic might, it's had a lot of sway over the committee. And if as many as a third of countries that previously had voted for them didn't vote for them this time, it makes me wonder whether the tide is turning slightly against China. It might just be that countries who supported China previously are now aware of things such as abuse of rights in Hong Kong and arresting political dissidents and their incarceration of the Uyghur minority in concentration camps. It might just be that these things have come to light and therefore some countries have decided to withhold their vote.
Yeah, it's quite significant that the voting, I think, is in secret so that you don't quite get an open Eurovision style result where you can actually look at who voted for whom and so on. I noticed that the UK government, when asked whether it voted for China's seat, wouldn't answer.
My understanding is that the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, wrote to her government counterpart, Dominic Raab, asking that the UK votes against China's membership of the council. I also find it really quite interesting that the UK government is refusing to say whether or not they voted for China to remain on the Human Rights Council, when its attitude towards China in the last year or so has not exactly been one of appeasement. You know, they've offered permanent residence for Hong Kong citizens. They've pulled out of allowing Huawei to have complete access to our 5G network. They haven't exactly played nice with China, particularly in the last year. I find it quite interesting that suddenly they're being awfully quiet with regards to this.
You sort of wonder now whether Britain actually has a foreign policy. It's not too many years ago that there were very big and contentious arguments about what kind of policy we should have towards ISIS in Syria and northern Iraq, for example.
Yeah.
All of that seems like a long time ago now, and that was the case well before this pandemic. It's perhaps to be expected that there'd be a certain amount of looking inward and insularity during such a massive health crisis. One would hope that a pandemic like this would lead to a renewed interest in internationalism and recognizing that plagues don't stop at national borders.
I think that's about all we have time for. So thank you for joining us this week, Adam. And we'll be back in a fortnight.